48 hours after taking office, Donald Trump made an unscheduled phone call to Vladimir Putin. No State Department advisors, no official translators, no public record in White House archives. And 72 hours later, Ukraine received an ultimatum. Accept Russian terms or the United States cuts all military and economic aid. I'm an international relations analyst with 27 years studying how alliances between powers are built and destroyed. And what I just described isn't speculation. It's the documented pattern of how Trump negotiated the end of the Ukraine war by delivering the country to Russia while Europe watched helplessly. The betrayal begins now. Let me explain how an American president sold out his European allies for a business deal with Moscow. During the 2024 election campaign, Trump repeated a specific promise: I'll end the Ukraine war in 24 hours. The media ridiculed it. Analysts called it impossible. European diplomats dismissed it as empty electoral rhetoric. But Trump wasn't exaggerating. He had a plan, and that plan didn't involve multilateral negotiations or careful diplomacy. It involved calling Putin directly and offering exactly what Russia wanted in exchange for something Trump valued more than a European ally's territorial integrity. During my career analysing negotiations between great powers, I learned that the most dangerous agreements aren't those that fail publicly. They're the ones completed in secret without affected parties having any voice in their own destinies. The Ukraine war had reached a militarily unsustainable stalemate for both sides. Russia controlled approximately 20% of Ukrainian territory, including Crimea and most of Donbass. Ukraine had lost hundreds of thousands of soldiers in failed counter-offensives that consumed NATO equipment valued at over $100 billion. The November 2024 American elections offered Putin an opportunity. If Harris won, the policy of unconditional support for Ukraine would continue indefinitely. But if Trump won, Putin knew he had someone he could negotiate with directly, someone who valued deals above principles, someone who saw alliances as business transactions. Trump won, and Putin waited for exactly the right moment to make his move. January 20th, 2025, Trump is sworn in as president. Within 48 hours, he makes the call that would change the European balance of power. The details of that conversation didn't appear in official transcripts because Trump specifically ordered there be no record. But we know what happened afterward, and those facts reveal exactly what was agreed. Putin presented clear terms. Russia maintains permanent control over Crimea and occupied Donbass regions. Ukraine formally renounces any aspiration for NATO membership. The United States lifts sanctions against Russian companies in energy and finance sectors. And most importantly, American companies get preferential contracts for Ukraine's reconstruction under Russian supervision. That last point is key. This wasn't about peace. It was about business. Trump got access for American corporations to reconstruction contracts worth approximately $500 billion over the next decade. Putin got international legitimization of his territorial conquests and an end to Western sanctions. And Ukraine wasn't on the call. Zelensky wasn't consulted, Europe wasn't informed until the deal was done. 72 hours after that call, American military aid to Ukraine was suspended, not gradually, not with diplomatic warnings. It simply stopped flowing. Ammunition shipments halted. Promised air defense systems never arrived. Intelligence sharing was cut. And then came the ultimatum to Kyiv: accept negotiation on Russian terms or face military collapse without American support. The European response was absolute shock, followed by institutional panic. Germany, which had spent 20 billion euros supporting Ukraine while completely reforming its defense policy, discovered that its most important ally had negotiated a European country's surrender without consulting Berlin. Chancellor Scholz issued an extraordinary statement. If the United States can abandon Ukraine without consulting its European allies, then the transatlantic alliance as we know it is over. Europe must accept that it can no longer trust American security guarantees. France responded even more forcefully. Emmanuel Macron convened an emergency summit of European leaders in Paris and declared publicly, "The United States has demonstrated that its security commitments last exactly until its commercial interests dictate otherwise. Europe must build strategic autonomy immediately because we're next on the sacrifice list." Poland, which had welcomed millions of Ukrainian refugees and positioned military forces on its eastern border, now faced the prospect of having Russian troops permanently stationed kilometers from Polish territory without any credible American guarantee. The Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, entered complete panic. If the United States abandoned Ukraine so easily, what protects Baltic countries from future Russian aggression? NATO's Article 5, promising collective defense, suddenly seemed as reliable as America's promise to defend Ukrainian territorial integrity. But here's what European media wasn't publicly reporting. Many European governments were secretly relieved. The war was economically unsustainable. Energy prices had destroyed industries. Sanctions against Russia hurt Europe more than Moscow. Defense budgets had exploded without producing military results. Publicly, European leaders denounced American betrayal. Privately, many acknowledged that Trump had offered an exit from a war Europe couldn't win and couldn't afford. This European hypocrisy explains why resistance was mainly rhetorical. Diplomatic protests, yes. Sanctions against the United States. NATO withdrawal, no. Independent military support for Ukraine, no. Europe screamed betrayal while secretly accepting that someone else made the difficult decision they lacked the courage to make. Zelensky faced any wartime leader's worst nightmare: complete abandonment by his main sponsor in the middle of conflict. Ukraine had built its entire military strategy around American support, American weapons, American ammunition, American intelligence, American training, American financing to keep the government functioning. When Trump cut all that, the Ukrainian military had approximately 3 months of ammunition reserves. After that, collapse. Zelensky desperately tried to mobilize independent European support. He visited Berlin, Paris, London, asking Europe to assume leadership of military support. But Europe lacked capacity to replace the American arsenal. European ammunition production was a fraction of what Ukraine consumed monthly. European weapon systems required years of training Ukraine didn't have. More fundamentally, Europe lacked political will. European governments that had supported Ukraine did so under American pressure and guarantees that Washington would lead. Without American leadership, European consensus collapsed immediately. Poland and Baltic states wanted to continue supporting Ukraine. Germany and France wanted to normalize relations with Russia. Italy and Hungary had wanted to end sanctions from the beginning. Without the United States forcing unity, each European country pursued its own national interests. This left Zelensky with an impossible choice: accept Russian terms that amounted to surrender, or continue fighting without sufficient external support until military collapse made terms even worse. On February 15, 2025, exactly 26 days after Trump's inauguration, Zelensky announced that Ukraine would accept negotiations under Russian terms. There was no other option. The country was militarily exhausted, economically devastated, and diplomatically abandoned. The negotiations in Istanbul lasted 5 days. Russia dictated terms. Ukraine accepted. The final agreement recognized permanent Russian control over Crimea and Donbass region, prohibited Ukrainian NATO membership, limited Ukrainian armed forces, and gave Russia veto power over Ukraine's foreign relations with Western countries. Trump declared victory. I ended the war in 30 days, just as I promised. No one else could have done it. Putin got everything he wanted without conceding anything, and Ukraine ceased to exist as a truly sovereign country. The Trump-Putin deal didn't just abandon Ukraine, It destroyed the foundations of the Atlantic Alliance that had maintained European peace for 75 years. NATO was built on a simple premise. An attack on one member is an attack on all. Article 5 of the founding treaty guaranteed that the United States would defend any European alliance country against external aggression. That guarantee only works if it's credible, and credibility requires confidence that the United States will fulfill its commitments, even when costly or inconvenient. Trump completely destroyed that confidence. If he abandoned Ukraine, a country the United States had promised to protect under the 1994 Budapest Memorandum, in exchange for Ukraine surrendering its nuclear weapons, then what value does an American promise to defend Estonia have? The Baltic states immediately began secret negotiations with Russia about neutrality agreements. Poland accelerated plans to build independent nuclear capacity. Germany and France initiated talks about a European army completely separate from NATO structures. Most significantly, several European countries began exploring bilateral relations with Russia outside NATO's framework. If they can't trust American protection, they need to accommodate the dominant regional power that is Russia. This created exactly the dynamic NATO was designed to prevent. Individually weak European countries negotiating from positions of weakness with a strong Russia instead of presenting a united front backed by American power. The fragmentation wasn't instantaneous. NATO continues to exist formally, but its function changed fundamentally. Instead of a credible collective defence alliance, it became a coordination forum where European countries discuss shared interests while privately seeking bilateral agreements with Russia to protect their own national securities. Trump had achieved what decades of Soviet and Russian pressure never could, fracturing the Western alliance from within by demonstrating that American commitments were conditional and revocable based on one president's transactional calculations. So what did Trump get exactly in exchange for betraying Ukraine and fracturing NATO? Reconstruction contracts worth approximately $500 billion over the next decade. American companies, many with connections to the Trump family and political donors, got preferential access to rebuild Ukrainian infrastructure destroyed during the war. This includes contracts to rebuild electrical grids, transportation systems, ports, airports and communications, all financed by international loans that Ukraine will pay for generations, with American and Russian companies sharing the benefits. Additionally, Trump negotiated lifting sanctions against specific Russian companies in energy and finance sectors. This opened opportunities for business between American and Russian corporations that had been blocked since 2014. Most important from Trump's perspective, he demonstrated to other world leaders that making deals with him directly can achieve results that traditional diplomacy cannot. If you're a leader willing to negotiate bilaterally with the United States, ignoring allies and multilateral structures, Trump will deliver. This transactional approach to foreign policy transforms alliances from security commitments based on shared values into business relationships based on immediate mutual benefit. Countries are no longer allies or adversaries, they're potential business partners. For Washington, this means fewer costly wars and more lucrative contracts. For the world, it means the end of a rules-based order, where alliances provided predictability and stability. Latin America watched Ukraine's abandonment and recognized a very familiar pattern. For 70 years, the United States promised Latin American countries that aligning with Washington meant security, prosperity, and protection against external threats. In exchange, Latin America accepted American leadership in hemispheric affairs. But whenever Latin American interests conflicted with American priorities, Washington abandoned its promises. Guatemala 1954, Chile 1973, Nicaragua 1980s, Venezuela now. The pattern is consistent. American alliances last exactly until they stop serving immediate American interests. Europe just learned the lesson Latin America learned generations ago. American security guarantees are reliable only when the United States decides that maintaining them benefits America more than breaking them. This revelation has profound consequences for global security architecture. If neither Europe nor Latin America can trust American commitments, they need to build independent regional security systems or accommodate alternative powers like China and Russia. China already offers that alternative: investment without political conditions, trade without geopolitical alignment demands, infrastructure development without interference in internal politics. The Trump-Putin deal over Ukraine didn't just change Europe. It accelerated the global transition from a unipolar order centered on the United States toward a multipolar system where countries have real choices about alignment. You know what the ancient Greeks said? Those whom the gods would destroy, they first make mad. Trump thought he made a brilliant deal. He ended a costly war. He secured lucrative contracts. He demonstrated he can achieve what traditional diplomacy cannot. But what he really did was destroy 75 years of European security order built on trust and American commitments. He proved to every American ally that US guarantees are temporary documents revocable by unilateral presidential decision. For 27 years I've studied how great alliances collapse, and it's always the same pattern. The dominant power decides that maintaining commitments is more costly than breaking them. It calculates it can abandon allies without consequences because its military and economic power is sufficient to protect interests independently. But those calculations always ignore long-term dynamics. Abandoned allies seek protection elsewhere. Adversaries recognize that the dominant power's promises are unreliable. Neutral countries conclude that aligning with that power offers risks without guaranteed benefits. Europe is building an independent army. Asia is re-evaluating alliances with the United States. Latin America is accelerating integration with BRICS. Each region is recognizing that the unipolar world where America guaranteed global security in exchange for leadership has ended. Trump negotiated $500 billion in reconstruction contracts, but the cost to American global power is incalculable. Without reliable allies, the United States faces China and Russia as isolated adversaries. Without credibility, American threats lose deterrent power. Without a rules-based order, the world reverts to pure power competition, where geography and population matter more than military technology. The secret deal between Trump and Putin didn't just betray Ukraine. It marked the moment when the American empire publicly admitted that its global commitments are unsustainable, and that its future requires withdrawing from security guarantees it can no longer wants to maintain. The question now is whether that withdrawal will be orderly or chaotic, whether the United States can negotiate a new position in a multipolar order, or whether it will try to maintain dominance through force even as alliances have collapsed. Europe, Asia and Latin America are preparing for either scenario. Because Ukraine's lesson is clear, when a declining empire must choose between principles and profits, it always chooses profits. And any country that trusts otherwise is inviting its own betrayal. The secret pact was completed, Ukraine was sacrificed, Europe was betrayed, and the world order that emerged from World War II finally died. Not on a battlefield, but in a phone call between two leaders who prioritized transactional deals over long-term strategic commitments. Time will tell whether this was the beginning of a stable new multipolar era, or merely the prelude to more destructive conflicts between powers without reliable alliances to restrain them.